All right, you're good to go then, Andrew. Brad, I'm going to start with you. They said a fireside chat, but they didn't even give us a fire, so we'll make the most of what we got. So let's chat around the most significant challenges that African payment leaders are facing now in the transforming payment systems.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. I recognize some faces. It's clearly an afternoon side of the equation today. So, payments. Across the continent, I sort of jotted down some points, and I guess we can talk about those.
Yeah.
The first one, and regulators in the room, please forgive me, but one of the biggest challenges we've got, certainly in the space that I'm having to navigate, is regulation and the differences of application of regulation and the difficulty to ensure that it actually is a fit for purpose type approach to how payments can be regulated. And so you end up with a sledgehammer for a remittance, right? And it becomes very clunky and expensive and difficult to manage. And I think if we can get the harmonization of that right, and we talk about it so much, and I'm looking at my colleagues, and, it's exactly one of those biggest problems. The other one about payments that I've always found fascinating is the concept of cash. And the fact that we're all things digital, and yes, the world is changing and everything's going online, and yet cash is stubborn. It's stubborn in countries, cross countries. It is a stubborn survivor in a space where we are trying to find a way of decashing these markets. And I think that's an important point. The other one is actually, to my mind, everyone thinks it's the tech that's going to solve the problems. The tech is probably the easiest part. And there's a lot of tech out there. And in fact, everyone, I get them coming to me at my office regularly, once, twice a month. Gosh, have we got a solution for you? It's tech. And you say, well, okay, what about all the other things? What about the regulatory approvals? What about the screening? What about the monitoring? No, you're doing that. We'll do the tech. That's the challenge. And so there's a clutter. I use the word clutter a lot, of tech that purports to be a way of solving for some of these the payments conundrums. And yes, you need it, but I think maybe it's also about the fact that there's too much clutter around the tech. And I think that's it's a key one to navigate. In some of the solving of that, you've got to be able to say, where do you navigate? What do you choose? Or do you have something that's a little bit more headless in its architecture? You're looking at the time. A headless on the architecture, so that you can respond to all this tech and not end up where you're replicating a ton of work and it's throwaway work because that piece of tech just didn't give you the reach that you were looking for. The final one is about education, in my view. Educating the market, not only the participants in the market, but the providers of the services in the market as well. And I think education is almost in every question. You've got to start with education and say, is there enough? Is there enough visibility? Is there enough awareness? I'll stop there.
Let's jump in there, Andrew. What are your thoughts around regulators, the tech clutter, and the education, as Brad's just mentioned?
There's so much more. There's so much more than meets the eye. I think Brad is spot on. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I can only add to it, right? Yeah. I think from where we sit, one of the biggest challenges that we encompass in the market is role responsibility. So we know that we have regulations. We know that there's somebody responsible, and there's always a misallocation of those role responsibilities. But identifying them in our market is one of the biggest challenges. And I think if you look at what a lot of the regulators are doing, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a ton more collaboration. It's events like this where I actually meet quite a few people that are playing in that regulatory space. So really, when it comes to what kind of advice I can give, it's really get more involved. If you're starting a business, if you're trying to do something bigger than what your competitors are able to do, really network and try and find out who is who in the zoo, because that really helps the framework on collaboration and open collaboration for these financial systems towards having a better financially inclusive society. I really, that's all I can add from my side.
Yeah. And from the tech side, I mean, you're not the traditional service provider and what we've become accustomed to over the years. So how does that digital clutter that Brad's referring to, how does that affect you or not affect you? How does that drive you or hinder you?
I think the biggest challenge that we have is everybody's on a race to zero in terms of pricing. Um, we're in a modern day society where we have so much technology. Technology can reduce the overall cost for all of these things, but price is very often seen as it's confused as value, right? It's part of the value chain. If you can get it to me at a cheaper price, great. But the biggest barrier of what we're seeing for these great technologies that are coming out is how long it takes for these regulators to actually make the decision. You could be speaking to the right person, and we have quite a few technologies right now where we are some 2 or 3 years and we're still waiting. I'm very often sitting in scenarios where I'm saying, great, I'm happy you've hired the team is doing what they need to, but 6 months later, you don't, we're still at stage one. And what affects us also affects the partners that we're trying to collaborate with and enable in this industry. So I think I'd really answer it by saying it's the speed of it, how quickly we can get to that resolution that really hinders us.
Yeah. I'm going to stay with you for a moment, Andrew. Let's talk about some effective payment systems and what strategies have proven to be effective in that space.
I like the question, Brad, and I think if I share a Peach Payments experience, I've been with the business, I've been in payments for almost 10 years now. Being part of having been one of the first clients Peach Payments ever had, I know what it's like to sit on both sides of the fence, right? So when you say strategies, it took us a long time to get there, but we hit 2020, 2021, where I think one of the biggest challenges for us is we only have so many developers, but there's so many different technologies coming out there. We want them all, but we can't have them all. So what technologies, what could we really do? And it actually took us quite a while to make that final decision. What we actually did in our scope is we went and created what we call a partner API. In the summit, I hear a lot of people talking about open banking APIs. It's a very similar component. It's a payment service provider coming out and say, great, you've got a new tender type. We want it. Instead of us taking 12, 15, 30, 40, 50 weeks to get it up, we've built now an intermediary layer that allows them to use their developer stack, which moves the burden away from us having to do that integration into the arms of those developers that will know better about that solution than what we do. Yeah. And that's really ramped things up. I think it's we've got quite a few technologies where we're proud to say we've literally from inception, discussion number one, commercial, to adoption and putting it in front of our merchants to whom we serve, anything under 8 weeks is now possible versus the 52 weeks. So I think that was probably the biggest thing that I'm most proud of in what we've done. We're very proud of the industry doing the same thing because with open banking APIs, like we're seeing a lot of collaboration in that space where if you look at the national payment system, they're now more inclusive than what they ever were before. They are coming to us and saying, hey, you weren't really part of this, but for all of the innovation that you're bringing, we'd love to take some consults, we'd love to collaborate. Would you be interested in building XYZ pieces of technology towards the same effect of what we did, right? Yeah. So it's moving. And I think towards my earlier comment on speed, it's moving rapidly, which is something really good to see.
And strategies around cost effectiveness, you spoke about the race to zero. So, what strategies do you have in place to keep those costs low? And I'd love to ask you that same question, Brad.
I'll keep it short on my side. I think in developing the partner API, really the answer's in there, right? We don't have to have a developer stack that's specialist in that specific language, in that specific tender type, and that really makes it much cheaper and easier for us, where the guys that we're dealing with already have these developer teams, right? And that was one of the biggest things that has offset the burden of cost sitting on our books. It's a big one for us.
Yeah.
Question is the cost really gone?
No.
So I think the race to zero, and we look at it and we all recognize that it's, and I spend a lot of time doing cross-border payments, cross-border remittances, and coming out of South Africa into the rest of the SADC region and beyond, we are, I'm looking at Maxine over there, where it's one of the highest in the world, certainly still double digit. And so we expect, and certainly organizations like World Bank expect it to drop to like 3%. And you think, well, okay, and we're doing our numbers and we look at it and we say, wow, it's starting to look like even the base cost is just too much to sustain like the 3%. There's not much in it. So in cross-border payments, and particularly remittances, and I'm hanging on to that, it's probably not about, there is a cost, and it's probably not about where the money is going to be made. It's going to be about the provision of the service and what you do with the client experience. And I know there's a question about customer experience being so important. Fundamentally, people do not wake up in the morning and get excited about making a payment. They get excited that they've been able to pay for their children's school fees or their university or managed to put food on the table. And underscoring that is the payment. So the experience is where your value is going to lie, and there will be a base cost that you will probably not get away from. And you're going to have to find the value elsewhere, because it's not going to be in the payment, certainly not in the short to medium term, or the long term for that matter.
Yeah. Talking about payments, let's talk about fraud. And we touched on cybersecurity and all the rest. I mean, that I think is a barrier to entry for a lot of people who feel tentative about electronic payments. Has it gone through? Have I done it all correct? And so in the consumer side, there's also fear of making a mistake, but then there's also what's the outside influences in the areas of fraud. Can you speak into that for us, Brad?
Yeah, fraud's a very difficult space. It is as innovative and efficient as the payment systems themselves. It is probably the one thing that still will always be a challenge. The challenge will be, though, to be able to provide the client experience that they expect, which is instant and immediate and fulfillment, gratification, versus, gosh, I've now got to click here and I've got to write in there and I've got to scan this and I've got to do this, just so that, or worst case, your credit card company just stops your card because they've decided it's a suspicious transaction. And that balance between the customer experience and the fraud is going to have to be a very difficult one, or sensitive one to try and manage. I think education is big, but it's probably not enough. I think the likes, and it's easy to say this, and I'm not a fraud specialist. The AI type environment, preemptive, the predictive, the assessment of data to be able to catch the fraudulent payments before it occurs is where it's going. But the fraudsters are going to be equally as astute to that, and for them it's their business, unfortunately.
Yeah, and then we're back to you need to invest into that and wanting to keep costs down, but you need to be, so that's sort of a cycle you're stuck in. Yeah, I'm not sure if you want to chat around fraud, Andrew, from your perspective.
If I latch onto some of the components that what Brad was saying earlier, technology isn't the only solution. I mean, we've got so many. If you look at 3D Secure, what 3D Secure is doing right now, you have two different versions. You have 3D Secure 1, 3D Secure 2.0. Most people don't know the difference, right? But to share it with you, 3D Secure 2.0, in essence, takes more into consideration than what 3D Secure 1 does. What if your partner has your phone? And they use your phone and they get that one-time PIN. It goes through. Now, as part of that retail decision, when you start saying, how do you leverage technologies like biometrics? The problem with biometrics, for example, pay by face, your biometric scanner on your phone, is a lack of integration between the single sign-on identity providers, for example, into the fintech space, into the ecosystem to enable payments, right? So it's saying the technology is there, but not all factors are being considered in how far you can go down that rabbit hole. And I think it's one of the arenas where we're very often asking for a lot more collaboration. We sit with Visa, MasterCard, and we say, well, we've got a pay by face. Would you be willing to adopt that in lieu of something as simple as 3D Secure, that one-time PIN, right? So I think it's really buried in that layer of how do we utilize these technologies in an open, collaborative state. In this forum, we discussed a lot of unregulated versus under-regulated. It's also looking at those industries. If you're doing a transaction today on buy now, pay later, for example, that people particularly love, the biggest thing that they're hindered with is it's unregulated or under-regulated. But how do you make that retail decision by leveraging artificial intelligence where Andrew has bought some dodgy product off a dodgy website, which is outside of his normal purchase pattern behavior, right? So the technology is there. It's just how do you connect it all together for me?
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Do you feel, Andrew, that there's this need to be technologically relevant and it's essential in where we're at, but for it also to be seamless and to be a really great experience? Do you feel sometimes that technology gets rushed? Can it get rushed? Is that
It inevitably does. If anyone's ever been part of a sprint here, I'm sure many people have. whatever a developer tells you, multiply it by 2 or 3, right? And while we laugh at it, I think it's because of, again, what Brad was saying earlier, have you considered all of the factors, right? Keeping things seamless is, I came through the educational arena of customers king, right? And very often you see that there's a lot of alienation that happens in the regulatory frameworks of, we care about you, Mr. Customer, we want to do right by you, but there's these barriers that stand in the way that are asking us for way more than what we was seeking to solve for in the first place. And that makes it really challenging, right? So when you say seamless, that for us as a payment service provider, that's always at the forefront. And we have spent a lot more time working around those items to try and making that as simple as possible. I know it doesn't really answer the question, but I think that's one of the key tenets of where we focus our energies. Like, it's a big play for us. User journey, UX, what simplifies things. We were lucky because we brought tokenization technology to South Africa, card storage, one-click checkout, subscription recurring billing. You call it what you may, right? In that environment, one barrier that I'll share with you is, did any of you guys know that that subsequent transaction that most of the merchants are experiencing is more expensive for the merchants than the first one, right? And it's not something that's really spoken about. I see what looks like a bit of a war zone when I'm sitting in front of a genius entrepreneur that's saying, I have this great idea to automate my technology. And I live in an incredibly, when you say seamless, I just want to say one thing more. If you look at what happened through COVID era, it's not over, but lifestyles have changed. Brad was talking about school fees. I use Carry App. I don't know if you guys have come across this, right? For my child's school, I'm using a lot of this technology. My food and grocery delivery, it's no longer get in my car, drive to the shop. It's literally one click. Log on, repeat order, and my items get delivered to my door. So that's also shaping the way we engage with all of these valued brands that we work with. But that's adopting that same seamless principle of making it as frictionless for the end customer as possible. It's a key theme.
Yeah. Brad, do you want to comment on that? On seamlessness, if that's a word? Seamlessness.
There's another payments conference in that, I'm sure. I mean, what you're saying is the customer's looking for seamlessness. They're looking for immediacy. And I guess at an innovation level, that's what everyone strives for. I don't know whether it's... It just still comes with cost, in my view. And so in a world of innovation, particularly on the front end, and it's sometimes maybe even better to step back and let the innovators innovate, as long as you can respond quickly to what they're doing. It may not be a first mover. It may actually be a fast follower that works in some of these situations.
Let's talk then about the customer experience, because we're talking a lot about what's happening behind the scenes and what you want to achieve and how it needs to be seamless and cost, but how do you shape it so that it is a great customer experience, that at the end of the day, I don't feel like this might work, this might not work, let's hope it works, but I guess we're coming back to seamlessness here, but as a customer on my end, it's running smoothly. What role does the customer experience play in the way you shape what you do?
It is paramount.
Yeah.
Absolutely paramount. It's often tricky to get it right. And when you get it right, you'll find the market will move to you. But it isn't an easy thing to always achieve. And the customer experience, it's just what it's all about. And my commentary was, customer experience is not about the payment, it's about the experience, right? So what is it that the data is telling you? And if you can't interpret the data, and that's a tough thing to do, you can't interpret the data, the behavioral side of it, then your customer experience is something that you're presuming as opposed to something that is real. And I think in this world, I think payments becomes almost, it has to be invisible. It will become, as I say, a consequence. It's the plumbing. It will become only the provider of the data and the behavior that you yourself then have to be able to harness into something that's monetizable and gives the customer the value they're looking for.
Andrew, what are you doing differently from competition or from maybe where you initially started to be able to cater specifically for the African market?
I feel like I need to just look around and see if my competitors are here before I give you an answer. There's a lot of things that we do differently. I think in the user journey space, we're talking a lot about technology, and I want to start from the barriers perspective. It is really difficult to become a payment service provider in any country of the world because suddenly the minute we can all sit here and say we believe that the customer is king, start with the customer in mind, let's think about what they want, and we've discussed some of the barriers. But from a technological or a digital perspective, I'm a payment service provider. I've got merchants that are on Magento, WooCommerce, Shopify. These are extremely and extraordinarily expensive platforms for a payment service provider like us to get involved in, right? So having now achieved that, it's then saying the next step of the journey is how do we refine, define, align on what it is that our customers actually want. And when we say seamless, like Brad was saying and everybody in this conference earlier, that could be an event on its own. And the reason why is because when you start looking at those barriers that we've just discussed, whatever we do on one platform, again, we get thrown back into the same circle arena of, I've done it for WooCommerce, now I've got to do it for Magento, then I've got to do it for Shopify. And in Shopify, most of my clients in South Africa ask me the question of, but you're the king, you can do subscription recurring billing on everything. But Shopify, what happened, right? It's again that collaboration component that we really need to start seeing from the global players that have less of an interest in our market. So if they don't have an interest in our market, you'll very often find me giving you a recommendation to, but there's better platforms out there. I'm not saying I don't like you, Shopify, right? I hope they're here and they hear me. We're not saying we don't like you. We're saying we want to work with you and we want to use our competitive advantage to help you gain a stronger market leverage to which you could become more strategically important. The second hyphenation of this is if you look at the typical user journey, and I like a lot of what was said much earlier in some of the sessions of, Brad was just saying it needs to become invisible, right? It's reducing that scope. Why should a transaction take you 5 to 10 minutes? Why should it? I mean, when you ask that question, it's often a grudge thing for a person to do. Like, it's frustrating, right? So you always want to sit in that environment of what we've done now is we've set it up in such a way that we've empowered the merchant to take full control. We're saying, great, if you want to do an API integration, it's there. The minute you start using any of the simpler plugins that we're providing, we've already thought about that. So there's no hosted redirects. You don't have to go to third parties' websites where, hey, hang on a second, I'm on a standard bank page. Can I really trust this, right? Well, it's your own page. You've done it 1,000 times before. Why now do you not trust it?
Yeah.
So it's also that component of educating the market to saying, once we empower the merchant, it's the merchant that brings that education layer to the customer to say, hey, you can trust us, but we've got a better ways of doing it. And if you have that better way, now you don't have to answer to the trust component.
Right.
So it's kind of like this, I can speak for hours, Brad, on this one, right? I'll end it there.
Brad, we're talking about collaborations here, but who leads? So who follows? Looking from the outside in, who's looking to who and saying they're getting it right or we're getting it right? Who leads and who follows in this collaboration?
Do you expect me to answer that?
Please.
Yes, we want to know.
I must admit, I don't know. I think perhaps it's a way of looking at it is to recognize what you're good at and what other organizations are good at. And make sure make sure you partner with them and partner with them cleverly so that they've got freedom to be able to be good at what they do. I think banks are often good at being banks, right? So applying the legislation, making sure that the money is secure, that the depositors are happy and feel comfortable, and the risk is definitely controlled and managed. Fintechs often have a better feel for how they want to show up and what the customer needs are. And then my research across the continent, which is my role, the fintechs are, mind you, they've had some bumpy bits in the recent time, but the fintechs are still showing a lot of the traditional market what it's all about. If you take, for instance, the MNOs, mobile network operators, they have absolutely led transactional banking outside of South Africa. And I'm saying outside of South Africa. They absolutely dominate. And so kudos to them. Now you've got to say, well, how do you partner? And that's a very difficult one to try and get right, but it's also the one that I think is meaningful. So let's play the role that a bank should play or could play, and recognize that there are others that probably are better at it in some regards. If you want to learn about it, you can do it over time. But I think there's a lot more to be gained if you're comfortable in your role, and your partner's comfortable in their role, and then the symbiotic relationship can manifest itself.
Yeah, thanks for that. Andrew, you're coming from a non-traditional background. I mean, when it comes to collaboration there and driving forward and innovation and seeing what's happening around you, I mean, how does that affect the decisions that you make?
It's a tough one, Brad, I think, because I come across so many different partners. I'll mention one for you. I mean, when we talk about MNOs, if we take it from that if you take the question from that orientation, like we already start by asking the question of they did well everywhere else, why did they fail twice in South Africa for certain ones that are out there, right? And it's using those data points to then say, can we use that as a learning curve or a trajectory to be better than what those guys failed at? It's an expensive way to learn, to go and make the same mistakes that somebody else made, right? Everybody knows this. So when you leverage, one of the things that I believe is social media platforms, you can already see them doing this today. They're starting to move into this arena of being able to take payments directly, very natively off their apps. So for me, it's almost saying, when you say how do we leverage it, I already anchored the point of the intermediary technology we built, which really does help us accelerate things. In terms of moving it towards what it is that the customers are asking for, we get this organically, right? And I think it's just, my answer really sits on having that open mindset. I have dozens of conversations with our competitors who look like competitors, but very big ideas get generated from that. And very often, we end up with the same typical partner of enabling the platforms or the merchants that we serve in the same way. And at that stage, it's more about looking at who are the merchants that I serve and how do I make sure that I remain relevant to them to generate some sort of stickiness and loyalty where we're in an industry where there's very little, right? But that would be it for me. How do we leverage it is we get it organically, so we're quite lucky in that space that we operate.
Yeah, we've been missing out on the opportunity to get some good questions in. So for those of you that are here while Andrew and Brad are sitting here, let's open the floor to some questions. Anyone got a question or two? We've got one here in front. If you don't mind bringing a microphone, we'll hear you, but just for the sake of everyone else. Thank you so much.
So, basically, my question is follow on from the previous people who came on the stage, and it's regarding hyper personalization. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to answer, but I'm just trying to think: how do you then strike a balance on customer experience? Do you really make sure that as a company you focus on just making sure that you ensure that the operation or whatever processes are seamless and secure, versus balancing that with providing that personalized experience? Because I can imagine that comes at a price. And when you look at the customers, they are quite diverse and their needs change each and every day. So how do you balance, as much as the trends are saying, yes, you need to personalize, but is it really something that you need to drive towards and that costs you a lot of money, versus saying, let's just do the basics right. Let's get the basics right. Yeah.
I'm happy to take that one. I get my hands dirty. When I say I get my hands dirty is we're very lucky because when you look at the team complement of the exposure that we have to the various regions we operate in, we're exposed to all of these things. When these new technologies come up, I, in many scenarios, get involved myself and say, hey, I'd love to help you, instead of you hiring this very expensive team that's going to do some A/B testing, user journey testing. If anybody knows what it costs to do UI, UX testing, it's extremely expensive. And in my view, it's almost unjustifiable. Now, how does that enable that one startup that has a limited budget in being able to do that? My honest answer to you is we literally get our hands dirty. My team gets involved. Even I, to my level, get involved in saying, hey, I'd love to test this. Can I get away with free accounts every now and again, which always helps. But that's almost like a trade-off to saying, let's use what I've garnered, what experience I've garnered, my team's experience, my developer's experience, as being part of your journey to success. That's my honest answer.
Thanks so much. Any other questions from the floor? We'll leave it at that. Andrew and Brad, thank you
Thank
so
you.
very, very much. Round of applause for them. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.